Wait. Oh my god. I am sorry for this. Oh, okay. You know what? Just give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. I had to mute that bullshit. Alright. Anyway. I have a groundbreaking theory here, combining multiple of my theories. This, I believe, may actually be it. This may actually be put an end to the tyranny, the terror of this world. I hope it will. It probably will. It seems like this is the best thing I've ever come up with, the best video I've ever posted for this channel. So, bear with me. Okay, so, brace yourself. We have something called the law of opposites, as I've went on in great detail to talk about on this channel. And another theory I came up with about how you cannot conceptualize as something that cannot exist in reality. Okay, I've talked about that on this channel as well. So therefore, if we can conceptualize if we can conceptualize of any pair of opposites, of any pair of opposites, and of the law of opposites, then everything has an opposite, and everything that exists has an opposite that actually exists. Therefore, pros and cons are opposite, is a pair of opposites. Therefore, if we can conceptualize of there being pros and cons to certain aspects of certain theories in Christianity, then we could say that in theory there can be actual cons. There can be actual cons to certain aspects of certain theories in major world religions, very popular theories within them. And we could also say, even use this to say that there can be paradoxes, because if we can conceptualize of a paradox, then it can happen at the very least. But if you wanted to say that it doesn't happen, but it can happen, that's fine. But I think that if it can happen, and you can conceptualize of it, and it can happen, there's a very high chance it'll happen at some point. With some things, it absolutely will. So, with a lot of things, actually. But either way, my point still stands. When you combine the law of opposites with my theory that I talked about how you cannot conceptualize something that cannot exist. Because then you'd be defying the laws of logic and reality to conceptualize something that cannot even happen in the reality that you're in. You'd literally be defying the reality that you're in just to conceptualize something that exists beyond it. So, like, we cannot conceptualize of certain things that are beyond logic. I mean, we can conceptualize them, but only up to a certain point. We can't conceptualize everything about them. But that isn't to say that they can't happen. But, so, exactly, and they do happen, and yet we cannot conceptualize everything about paradoxes. But maybe that's because some things with paradoxes, maybe paradoxes are the exception, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's that the things that we can't conceptualize about paradoxes have nothing to do with what can be conceptualized, which is why they'd be the exception. Because you gotta remember, paradoxes are beyond reality. So when I say that there's something that we can conceptualize, when I say that there's something that if we can conceptualize of it, it can exist. I mean, it can exist in some sort of way. It can exist in a logical way or an illogical way. As I've talked about, illogical ways to exist are the paradoxical ways, The logical ways are the non-paradoxical ways. So if you can't conceptualize something that is logical, or you can't conceptualize of something in a logical way, then you're conceptualizing a paradox, which happens to, again, be beyond the laws of logic and reality. So it kind of just defies concepts anyway. I mean, because paradoxes, by definition, would be able to defy concepts. They'd be beyond concepts, since concepts are what literally create. I mean, the laws of reality create concepts, but then paradoxes are just outside of the laws of reality themselves. So concepts are below the laws of reality, which are below paradoxes. So paradoxes would be the exception, but still, it doesn't change the fact that what I was saying earlier is true also. We can conceptualize of, pros and cons being one example, one pair of opposites according to the law of opposites. And so you could say that there is, in theory, there is a pro and a con for every scenario or every way of things being done in major world religions. So, for example, Jesus' crucifixion, you could say that there are only, they already say that there are pros and cons to Jesus' crucifixion, right? They say that Jesus' crucifixion, the pros were, Jesus is saving at least some people is what it's saying, and then it's saying that he's paying for the sins of all, but still it's saying the cons are that he has to endure eternal torment for the sins, and that it's an injustice that he does. It's a double-edged sword. It's justice and injustice. But the problem is, it's just you could stop there, but you could also take it steps further. You could take what I was saying even further if you want. I wouldn't stop there. I mean, you could literally take it a step further. You could take the facts that I'm saying as granted as true and say that, well, actually, it doesn't stop there, because you can use the law of opposites with the other thing I was saying. So, the other theory. And you could say that there is a, how do I put it? There's pros to, there's another aspect of the crucifixion that has to be addressed here, and that's what I was criticizing in my older videos, is that there's a quantitative aspect in theory of pain and pleasure, and the amounts are the quantitative is a quantitative measure of how much of those are earned and not earned by people in all creation that even can earn those things. And I'm not saying all creation can earn those things, but I've talked about why. I've talked about this many times. But taking that into consideration, and then you combine it with the other things I'm saying, it could very well be true that there's pros. In theory, there are cons to how do I say it? There are major cons to there not being a scenario where there is not quantitative. How do I say it? There is not a quantitative measure of earnings of pain and pleasure. Because the Christianity postulates that there is that its lore is true, and in this lore there is not a quantitative righteous measure, just measure of these things in terms of earnings. When like I'm saying, according to this, what I'm saying, it could be true that since we can conceptualize of my theory since we can actually conceptualize my theory here, being a thing, then it could happen, And they'll say that, oh, well, the Christians will say, oh, well, it can't happen, But they'll say it can't happen, it's not possible according to logic. And they'll say that because they'll say that God, that would be paradoxical, and they'll say that it's paradoxical for God to be able to do anything. Yet, if we can even conceptualize of God being able to do anything on some level, then it must be possible, which would mean that paradoxes are possible. Like, if we can even conceptualize of paradoxes, then they must be possible. Like, I know we can't fully conceptualize of paradoxes. We can't conceptualize everything about them, because there's things that there's facets of paradoxes that aren't even conceptual to begin with. So you can't really conceptualize everything about a paradox, but you can conceptualize. But if you can even conceptualize, I guess what I should have said is, if you can conceptualize of something, even to some degree, it must be possible to happen. So, because, like I said, and I gave examples anyway, just apply the same logic to paradoxes, and that would already just show that I'm right. So I don't even have to make this be about, Christianity. I can just make this be about paradoxes, because, and there you go, then that would just, refute Christianity because, as a whole, because, like I said, you don't have to use it with the crucifixion. I think that's just, that you could, but I would just do it with paradoxes, because the Bible just plainly refutes the notion that paradoxes are possible anyway. Like, or that God can make paradoxes happen by some means, when in fact he can. And I've given evidence anyway, but if you use the law of opposites, like I said, if you use the law of opposites and you use this other thing I was saying, that if you can conceptualize something, it must be possible, or it can happen. So, the same thing with law of opposites. If, everything has an opposite, and everything's opposite must exist. Otherwise, that very thing would not exist itself. Like, for example, 2 would not exist if negative 2 did not exist. Good would not exist if evil did not exist. Or, I mean, according to the natural order of things. Now, you could say there are scenarios where evil would not exist, but good would. I mean, that is true. I mean, it really depends on the opposites, but the law of opposites also talks about how if this thing exists, its opposite must at least be able to exist, even if it doesn't yet exist or hasn't. I mean, like, just because good exists and evil doesn't mean evil can't exist. I think what I'm saying is, if a thing exists but its opposite doesn't, then, I mean, actually, no. I mean, it's more like everything exists and its opposite exists, but its opposite doesn't necessarily exist in the same way. Like, good can occur in the world in the ways we're used to, but if evil did not occur in the world the ways we're used to, it would only exist in a specific way, a way that I would call in theory. Evil would only exist in theory. It wouldn't exist yet in some very apparent way, the ways we understand them to regularly. And so in that case, I would say that it's like, so basically, it's not that if a thing exists but its opposite doesn't exist. No, it's everything. So that it really is just true that if a thing exists, its opposite must exist, at least in some way, in some form. But if it wasn't that, it would just be that it at least could exist. So, because like I said, if, let's say that good existed, but evil did not. If evil did not exist, but good existed, then evil wouldn't even exist in theory. If evil didn't even exist in objective theory, or in any form, then that would simply be a paradox, because the natural order of things and the actual way things work necessitate it being a possibility. Yet that would be ignored through a paradox, and so it would just be a paradox. So like, naturally everything must be able to exist, at least in theory. So basically meaning paradoxes are possible. So, and if paradoxes are possible, then that's one thing. But people, neurotypicals and Christians will still say, oh well, just because a paradox is possible doesn't mean it does happen, and it doesn't mean that God can make it happen. So, but still, what I'm saying is that if it's possible, it must exist, because in some way, I didn't say if it's possible it must exist in a specific way that clearly is contrary to the evidence. I'm saying it must. All I said was that it must exist. That could mean it must exist in at least some way that is not contrary to the evidence or the real life happenstance. It's just in some really strange, abstract way. Like I said, it's like everything exists. It's almost like you'd say everything exists, but only in theory. But some things only exist in theory, and will always only exist in theory. And then there's a lot of things that don't only exist in theory, but they exist in like they actually exist in the ways we understand, that most people understand when they say, well, this thing exists. Like, when you tell someone this exists, if you told someone Santa Claus exists, they wouldn't think you meant that it only exists in theory. They'd probably just say you were naive enough to actually think Santa Claus actually exists according to the lore of Santa Claus. But no, you don't have to mean that. For all we know, a person who said that could have actually meant that it only was smart enough to actually realize that Santa Claus only exists in theory. The lore of Santa Claus, that version of Santa Claus only exists in theory. It doesn't actually exist as per the exact lore of Santa Claus. So, the same logic can be applied to paradoxes. You could argue that they only exist in theory, but if they exist in theory, they do at least exist in some way. And so that's already contrary to the notion of Christianity, which says that, well, yeah, I mean, blah, 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 but at the end of the day, paradoxes not only cannot exist, but do not exist, because they cannot. And yet, because I say, if even God, it says it's impossible, and the Bible's definition of impossible is that it cannot happen and it won't happen. So there are many different definitions of impossible out there, but like I said, the Bible's definition, your typical's definition, is that happens to be that if it's impossible, it cannot happen. And if it cannot happen at any point in history, then it won't happen at any point in history. However, some would say that if it cannot happen, that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. But so there is that definition too. It just depends which definition we're using. However, how do I put it? Just give me a second to think about this. Yeah, but I mean, essentially, the Bible says that it does at least say that God, it does at least say that God can't make paradoxes happen. So, but I don't think it's saying. But if it's saying that paradoxes can happen, but God can't make them happen, then it's basically saying there's something beyond God that can make paradoxes happen. It's basically saying there's some means by which paradoxes happen, but God can't make it happen. Even though it also says that God is the most powerful being, and that nothing has more capability than Him or ever could. So that would be a paradox in the Bible. It would be a contradiction in the Bible. And if we accept the presupposition that it has no contradictory claims in its own book to its own claims, then it must not be saying that. It must be saying that, that nothing could ever make a paradox happen. So, which would basically mean that God can't make paradoxes happen, and that paradoxes can't happen by any possible means whatsoever. And yet, I just demonstrated through logic, observation, and theory that paradoxes can happen. They just, at the very least, can happen in theory. So, and if they can happen in theory, like I said, how can we even conceptualize of a paradox unless it actually happens? So, but use this for the crucifixion of Jesus. Use this logic for the crucifixion of Jesus. If we can actually conceptualize of explanations for why, you can actually conceptualize of explanations for why it's irrational to believe that there's not a quantitative measure of justice through pain and pleasure as the units of measure, then if you can actually conceptualize of that, then it could be true by some means, actually, that's actually a part of justice, contrary to the Bible's simplistic take on justice. So, I'm not saying the Bible doesn't get anything right about justice, but it does get some seriously big things wrong about justice. So, but either way, yeah. So anyway, wait a minute. Yeah, somehow. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, as I was saying, you know what? I don't know why. Okay, that's better. Yeah. Anyway, the fact still remains. You could use that for the crucifixion. You could say that it means that well, I mean, all that theory really does is just say that it could happen. But what I'm trying to say here, on its own, that's all it says. But like I said many times, repeated myself countless times in just this video alone, not to mention the other ones where I talked about pretty much the same theory and theories with different examples. I don't really remember if I combined these two theories in any of those videos, but I do know that I can't remember at the moment, but I do at least know that I talked about both of these on separate occasions, and I do know that you can use this. I didn't use the Jesus crucifixion as an example. I at least can remember that much. Like I said, I really have a hard time nowadays finding motivation, as much motivation as I used to, for this channel. And it's not really because of the lack of progress as much as subscriber count, as much as it is the other things I've talked about. So it's not changed. I don't think that's going to change. But in all seriousness, how do I put it? Yeah. So basically, yeah. I'm thinking about this. Well, yeah. Like I said, if you could say that if 2 existed, but -2 didn't exist in the way we understand it to, then it would exist. It would have to exist, but just not a way we understand. But what if 2 existed, but -2 only existed in theory, but didn't exist in the way but didn't exist mathematics, in an objective mathematical way, only in a theoretical mathematical way. So it could exist in math, but only theoretically, not objectively. So then for that to be the case, for things to ever get to that point, there would have to be a lot of paradoxes happening anyway. So the same logic applies to the crucifixion. I'm saying here, like these theories applying to the crucifixion being phony and bullshit. Like you could apply these two theories to anything, any facet or part of the crucifixion, or any theory in the Bible, and you could still come out saying that it actually could be true, that like a bunch of these things I've been debunking about Christianity could actually be legitimate debunks. Like they at least can be, so, But really, you can experiment with those on your own, but I think, like I said, it would be a lot easier if you just did what I did. I literally walked through this entire video explaining this notion, that paradoxes can exist, despite the Bible saying the contrary. I mean, what more proof do you need? Like I said, if you can't conceptualize of... I gave the evidence, more evidence in this video than any other, that if you can't conceptualize of a thing, or if a thing cannot be conceptualized of by the means which it can be today, then it cannot exist. Even in theory, it cannot exist, which is already a paradox. And you could apply that to anything. Like if you cannot even conceptualize of the number 2, if the number 2 cannot be conceptualized of by any means possible, then yet you still want to say that everything else in reality is consistent and stable, then you'd just be lying to yourself. And if it'd just be a lot of paradoxes, more paradoxes than there already are. And I mean, I'm not sure how many things would make logical sense, but I just know a lot less things would make logical sense than now if the number 2 didn't exist and it could not. You see, there's a difference between if a thing exists and if it can exist. But they still are honing in on the same sort of things here. Like I said, and I've been demonstrating that this entire video. Like number 2, if number 2 couldn't exist, but it did exist, that's a paradox. Or if the number 2, if the number 2 existed but it couldn't exist, that's a paradox. But if the number 2 didn't exist but it could exist, then that's also a paradox, because if it can't exist, then it can't exist in theory. And if it can't exist in theory or in any way, but it exists anyway, there's a paradox. And if it doesn't exist at all, but it can exist in theory, then that's also a paradox, because if it exists in theory, it exists, yet you also say that it doesn't exist. So one thing's for sure, paradoxes can exist, because they can at least exist in theory. And if they can at least exist in theory, then what's there to say they don't actually exist? And I'm not saying that logic applies to everything, but it could apply to everything, but it doesn't. Like, paradoxes can exist. They do exist in theory, but that doesn't mean they exist in the ways that I've been talking about. That alone doesn't prove it, but other things do prove it, though, like I've been giving evidence of. Yeah, I mean, like, if you can conceptualize of 2 plus 2 equaling 5, which I just did anyway when I just said this just now in this recording, like the old phrase, can God make 2 plus 2 equal 5? That's a paradox. And then people, you have mixed answers, of course, and Christians will always have said no, except for I suppose some heretical denominations, but not even many heretical denominations would say that. I'd imagine most heretical denominations aren't that smart. But anyway, In all seriousness, how do I put it? How else can I put this? I think the only other thing I could do to make this any more obvious than it already is to me, and I mean not any more obvious for me, but maybe, but there's certainly the only way I can make this more obvious for my viewers, I suppose, would be to draw it out. As I said many times, a visual aid, an illustration is a memory technique. It's a certified memory technique and has been for ages in and out of the educational organizations that most of the world has been enslaved to. So, but anyway, like I said, bottom line is, I might draw. Okay, I'm kind of debating real quick right here. Should I draw this out and put it in this video? But before I make that decision, I just want to try to figure out a better way to put this. Like I said, I do a lot of improv on this channel. I just wing it, and I have had success anyway. Because, like I said, as I explained on this channel, how I have such a gift for these things. How I have such a gift, such spiritual gifts. How I have such a gift for spirituality, religion, when most of the world doesn't. Because again, I don't lack the level of compassion that most do. My brain is not that, it's not damaged in that regard. So, but anyway. And no, I'm not going to explain the intricacies of that in this video. No, I'm not going to explain that in the next video, or the next one, or the next one. Chances are I won't. Unless it has something to do with that, but it probably, I don't see why it would at the moment. But either way, if you want to know why that is, like I said, I already mentioned, I talked about it already. I'm not going to do the courtesy of giving the exact video cross-reference you get in this video. I don't even know which one it is. I don't know which number video it is out of how many videos I make. I have no clue. I don't care that much about my own channel to do that. Like, if it was wildly more successful, I probably would, but it's not. So there you go. But either way, how do I put it? Just give me a second. Make this pretty easy. Yeah, so like, finally I found something I can draw on there. So basically, I intend to draw at least, I don't know what that was. Sorry, I at least intend to draw this out for this last part of this video. I intend to at least draw this on my sketch pad, just to make this even easier for neurotypicals to understand. Okay, so just give me a second. The best analogy I can give for now, the closest thing I can come up with after many trials and errors on my notepad in the past few minutes, I finally came up with the best thing I can come up with, which is this. This is an analogy of what I was saying about if it cannot exist, if it cannot exist, then I cannot conceptualize of it. If I cannot conceptualize of it, then it cannot be conceptualized of. If it cannot be conceptualized of, it cannot even be illustrated. And so basically, this is an example of what I'm saying. You know, in reality, we have a sandwich. We have Then you have the lettuce in the middle, right? These are components of it. In some reality where the neurotypicals must think is not, it must think is paradoxical and therefore is impossible. You could have it be that two buttons could exist in an alternate universe, which is even more paradoxical. And then you have two buttons, the same two buttons, except in this one, lettuce cannot exist. The same exact thing, except in this universe, lettuce can't exist. In the original universe, lettuce can. And so you see, that's what I'm saying, is that essentially, it's retarded to say that you can conceptualize of something that cannot exist. And so basically what I'm saying here is true. You know, clearly I was right, is that we can conceptualize of lettuce. But imagine this was our reality. This was the reality. Lettuce couldn't exist. If lettuce couldn't exist by any means, would I have been able to draw lettuce on this piece of paper to illustrate it? No, I would not be able to. Because if it couldn't exist, then nothing, then by what means? Well, like I said, by no means could it exist. If by no means it could exist, then there's no way to illustrate it, because there's no way for it to exist by any means or in any way. And so basically it doesn't exist even in theory. And so that's basically what I'm saying. The same logic applies. That's basically what I was saying earlier. If you can't conceptualize of it, if it cannot be conceptualized of by any means, then it cannot exist by any means. But if we can conceptualize of it by some means, it can exist by some means. So therefore, we can conceptualize of a paradox by some means, it can exist by some means. The logic is the same as what I just showed in this illustration. It's just the other way around. Instead of it being that if we can't conceptualize, if it cannot exist in any way or even in theory, then, you know, basically what I was saying. So just apply the logic, okay? This is the best I can do to illustrate this, give an analogy and illustration for now. So yeah, I mean, basically that's the entire premise. I mean, I don't know, whatever. But let me know what you think. Do you think that this could be a good analogy? Like, let me know. Do you think if this is the same as with paradoxes, like if we can't conceptualize of it, it can't exist? Well, yeah, sure. But do you think if we can conceptualize of a paradox, then it can exist? And do you think that's contrary to what the Bible says? Basically, you could write a syllogism for this. Like, sorry. Anyway, you know, I don't want to write it, but I would have wrote something like if a bun with lettuce in between can exist, it can be illustrated. But if it can exist in the way by the means that it does, it can be illustrated. This can be represented through an illustration. But if it can't exist by any means, it cannot be represented through an illustration. That would be premise A, and premise B would have to be completely symmetrical to it and congruent to it in its logic, like in geometry. Like, except it wouldn't be buns with lettuce. You know, a really simplistic example would be a much more complex example. Like I was saying, paradoxes versus versus conceptualization of things. Can you conceptualize if and you would just like draw the two premises side by side, and the logic should be congruent. If it's really actually true, if it's a true theory, it'd be able to be applied all the way through for both examples, and it would stand true for both. So maybe I'll write that out some other time, but I think what I've said here is enough to run the point home. Well, let me know what you think, but please like, share, subscribe if you thought it was interesting, if you thought it was a good video. Well, anyway, I'm out. Bye.